Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do tank Adelphi, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. We are your hosts, Raquel Monayer.
And I'm Alexandra Steinkraus. In this series, you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in the changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow @ClimateDiplo on Twitter. Welcome back to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the complex relationship between war, increasing climate-related hazards, and environmental degradation in Yemen, and how these dynamics are undermining security and driving further conflict. We are joined today by Hisham Al-Omeisy and Sinéad Barry. Hisham is a senior Yemen Advisor with the European Institute of Peace. He previously worked for the U.S. State Department, the UN, and the Coral Group. He has over 20 years of experience working with government and non-government organizations on Yemen, frequently speaking at international conferences and providing analysis to news programs on Yemen and the Middle East region. Sinéad is an analyst at Adelphi's climate diplomacy and security team and conducts external research on migration and post-conflict transitions in West Asia. Sinéad is also one of the authors of our team's most recent climate security assessment on Yemen that was undertaken in collaboration with the team at the European Institute of Peace. Long introduction, but warm welcome to the both of you. Thanks for joining for this month's episode. So, Hisham, at the end of last year, in December 2024, you briefed the United Nations Security Council on your experience in Yemen and the wider challenges that the country is facing. Could you start us off on this episode by talking us through some of the dynamics you spoke about and how things have developed in Yemen since that briefing happened?
Sure, definitely. Yemen continues to face mounting operational and logistical challenges that are exacerbated by the restrictions of Yemeni factions, the targeting of local staff working with civil society, international NGOs, and the UN, which, as you can imagine, it's making work on the ground very difficult. And on top of that, we have the attacks in the Red Sea that are actually currently going down after the Gaza ceasefire agreement. But who knows? I mean, attacks could resume any minute if that deal falters. Also, amid this flurry of problems, we have the continued economic downturn in Yemen. The provision of essential services has even become more challenging because of the lack of investment, the debilitated infrastructure, and lack of revenue for the government as well. And with the Yemeni rial hitting yet another all-time low against foreign currencies, the economy is a bit in tatters. On the funding side for Yemen, that funding has been historically low. And with every passing year, there's little less available from donors, even for critical pools such as the humanitarian response plan. This year would even be more difficult with U.S. funding being halted and many organizations that are already having to interrupt their work and redraw their strategic plans. I've heard of a lot of people getting laid off, a lot of projects, some programs being shut down, and even some of the NGOs leaving the country. And this is one of the things that I spoke about at the Security Council, is that Yemen needs quite a lot of things. But it starts with adopting a holistic and inclusive approach to bring all the relevant stakeholders to start working on addressing the roots of the conflict and to improve the prospect of a sustainable peace.
Thank you very much. For listeners who haven't watched the full briefing yet, we'll also link it in the episode description if you want to revisit that. And one of the things that we'll focus a bit on this podcast that you didn't necessarily mention in your briefing at the Security Council wasn't explicitly mentioned, but of course you've been working quite substantially over the past few years with the climate and environmental crisis in Yemen and all these risks that Yemen faces. So with the European Institute of Peace, you've been working over the past years to close these gaps in our understanding of how climate, environment, and conflict intersect in the context of Yemen and how this translates into local realities. So could you expand a bit more about your work in consulting and exchanging with local communities there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, running for 10 years now, Yemen's conflict has significantly harmed its natural environment. Military activity has caused direct environmental damage, and other pressures such as the over-extraction of groundwater and challenges in public environmental management have intensified those environmental issues. And on top of all of this, the effects of climate change, for example, through flash floods and droughts, exacerbated the situation on the ground. For the EIP, while there is increasing recognition that the environmental degradation and the impacts of climate change leave an important imprint on Yemen within the context of the conflict, more work needs to be done to understand and address the environmental drivers of the conflict. And when we kicked off our work within the Institute's Environmental Pathways for Reconciliation project, we understood that we need to start by establishing a baseline and take stock of the dimensions and extent to which the environmental issues link with the conflict in Yemen. This was back in 2020, 2021. My colleagues and I consulted about 16,000 Yemenis on their perspectives on peace and reconciliation, and environmental issues actually stood out as an unexpected priority. So we wanted to understand what this means in the context of the conflict. So the project that started the environmental peacemaking, it took the Institute's approach to environmental peacemaking, which is to leverage natural resources, environmental and climate change issues as an entry point or elements for conflict resolution, opening dialogue, fostering cooperation over common problems. Parties can work together, coming up with joint solutions that address environmental issues. This also contributes to improved resilience against security risks related to environment and conflict, while at the same time also contributing to trust building and social cohesion. We follow a bottom-up approach at the Institute because we recognize that inclusive participation of groups marginalized in political discussions and formal peace negotiation is fundamental to sustainable peace. And with this in mind, our project took a bottom-up approach, engaging as many people as possible across various governorates to hear perspectives of the people most affected by issues related to natural resources, environment, and climate change, so that we can voice them up to relevant authorities at the governorate and national level. And in the consultations that we conducted were large-scale consultations, engaging over 3,600 Yemenis across 13 governorates in the north and south. We talked to women, youth, religious leaders, security authorities, environmental leaders, policymakers, to hear their voices of the local populations on environmental issues that contribute to conflict within their own communities, and also, most importantly, for us as conflict resolution organization to learn about their perspectives on ways to jointly address environmental and conflict risks. And some of the key findings and learnings, and I'm outlining just only three, there are many, were basically on the urgency of the environmental issues. We had close to 70% of survey respondents acknowledge that climate change impacts their family and community lives. 92% perceived the reduced access to natural resources in past years, notably in water, gas, and oil. And this has been evident as economic and humanitarian consequences, but also bears risks with a view to peace and reconciliation efforts. It complicates them. Environmental factors can also drive tensions and disputes at the local level. More than half of the survey respondents indicated that they have experienced or heard of tensions or conflicts in their own districts in relation to environmental issues. And also opportunities, of course, to solve all problems and doomsday scenarios. While these issues tend to put aside in discussions about peace in Yemen, addressing these two dimensions in an integrated manner does not only respond to the conflict risk implied in the unaddressed environmental issues, but can actually be an entry point for collaboration, trust building, and dialogue. This is also reflected in the consultation findings. A clear majority expressed their support for an approach that integrates environmental considerations into conflict resolution in Yemen. For the EPFR project, focusing on these environmental opportunities for peace, the project contributes to amplifying and including Yemeni voices and political and peace discussions from the community, and kind of elevating them to the highest level, or whether it be this regional, local, or even international stakeholder level. And it also serves as a pilot to gather learnings on the opportunities and limitations of environmental peacemaking to be shared with the international peace and security community, and to promote peace approaches that are sensitive to environment and climate-related risks. I hope that wasn't too long.
No, that's really helpful. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm always impressed with how EIP can kind of flip the script on this and not only talk about the risks that are arising for some of these climate change and environmental impacts, but really look at these opportunities and entry points for peace. And now, Sinead, I want to come to you as you've been working with Hisham and the EIP team on some of these topics within the Weathering Risk Initiative at Adelphi. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in the introductions, there is the recently authored Undercurrents report that was undertaken together. Could you tell us a little bit more about the assessment and how conflict, climate change, and the environment is intersecting in Yemen?
Hi, yes, of course. And thank you very much for having me on the show, Alex. So maybe a good place to start is to build a little bit on what Hisham has outlined and give some background, firstly, on why we did this study. So as Hisham said, Yemen is facing a severe civil war, which is primarily occurring between the internationally recognized government of Yemen, the Houthis, and other national and regional actors. However, in addition to this national level, there is significant violence also occurring at the local level, within and between communities, and often this level is missing from accounts of Yemen's war. And as Hisham has alluded to, a lot of this conflict revolves around availability of and access to environmental resources. And also it's important to note that these have been occurring for a long time in Yemen, independently of the civil war. But we know now that the situation is different. And Yemen is one of the most vulnerable nations globally to climate change, and that the ongoing war has wrought absolute catastrophe on Yemen's natural environment. So we wanted to dig into this a little bit further in a study. And so to do this, we partnered up with Hisham's team in EIP, who we are already working with as part of our Peace Pillar initiative. And with them, we use the weathering risk methodology, which helps us unravel some of these complex links between climate change, human security, and conflict, and built this story out from what individuals in Yemen are saying about their experiences navigating these challenges. And what came out of it was this report, Undercurrents, which looks at all of these different dynamics of war, climate change, environmental catastrophe, and local conflict, and traces how they all connect up with one another. And the report focuses on two key natural resources that are often at the core of conflict and insecurity in Yemen: water and fertile land. And now I won't explain everything we found as part of the assessment, and do encourage listeners to read it, but I will give a quick overview of some key trends. So firstly, on water, climate change is exacerbating and is likely to continue to exacerbate pre-existing water scarcity, while the civil war is reducing access to water. This is partially because civil war parties are weaponizing these water resources and water infrastructure. And as a result, competition has grown over remaining resources, particularly among farmers. And it is, of course, very important to note that competition between farmers over water resources doesn't always or even usually end in violence. But at the same time, violence over water resources is ubiquitous in Yemen, and competition does frequently escalate into violent conflict. And these conflicts have been reported in every governorate in Yemen and cause up to thousands of deaths a year. Then on land. So arable land is being reduced by a combination of desertification, serious flooding, and very importantly, the impacts of the civil war. And these issues are really not being managed well by governing authorities, which exacerbate the problem, which then leads to increased competition over land between farmers or between displaced communities and long-term residents and others, and sometimes leads to conflict.
Thanks very much, Sinead. So reading the report, something that strikes me is how many of these challenges like conflict, displacement, and extreme weather events, which a lot of people we may not intuitively think of separately, seem to stack on top of one another. What does this mean in the response?
Yeah, like you say, Alex, these dynamics are really highly interconnected. And even at a very superficial level, it's hard to think about natural resources separately, particularly when you think about water and land, which we focus on in the report. So just for an example, the Yemeni labour force is very much concentrated in farming, which accounts for more than 40% of total employment and around 2/3 of women's employment. So to farm, obviously healthy land is needed, but so is a sufficient consistent supply of water to irrigate fields, to grow crops. So we really need to think about these things together. But one place where the compounding nature of these challenges really surfaces is when we try to look at this from a response perspective. So take the IRGY, the internationally recognized government, for instance. One problem is its institutional capacity. And the IRGY doesn't have dedicated disaster prevention, response and recovery agencies. It has very, very little money, and it struggles with legitimacy in many territories, even the ones that it does control. And as a result, it's very difficult for authorities to anticipate extreme weather events and take measures to prevent them. So one problem that emerges as a result of this is that waste and conflict debris are in canals needed to control floods and aren't being cleared, which make floods worse. But then another significant factor in how extreme weather events like floods unfold is displacement. So approximately 4 million people in Yemen are displaced, around 13% of the total population. And this issue is intersecting with increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. So for example, in Aden, IDP settlements, that's IDP is short for internally displaced person, for listeners that aren't familiar. So IDP settlements sprung up and developed in low-lying areas that previously acted as natural flood draining systems. And this has led to more and worse floods in these areas, creating cycles of extreme weather events and displacement. And some families who were initially displaced by the civil war were displaced 2 more times by floods. So to sum up, when we're thinking about response, while it's tempting to try to untangle these issues and tackle them one by one, this approach probably won't be very successful. And in conflict contexts like Yemen, where authorities struggle to implement any kind of policy, let alone long-term resilience strategies like climate adaptation, and the effects of conflict, which include widespread displacement, are hugely determinant of how extreme weather events play out and affect populations. So when designing policies and programming, it's important to understand how all of these issues like conflict, displacement, and extreme weather events intersect and compound one another. So responses can really meet Yemen where it's at and ensure effectiveness.
Thanks, Sinead. This is really helpful to understand some of these dynamics, but also what it actually means a bit more practically rooted in both international response and other things along those lines. Hisham, if you could expand on the idea and what EIP is doing in Yemen?
Sure. As mentioned earlier, one of the things that we learned from the consultations is that the environmental issues, notwithstanding the highlighted challenges, including the many things and the many issues that we have that Sinead had mentioned earlier, is that they can provide a crucial entry point for dialogue and cooperation. It allows to frame and concentrate discussions around common interests instead of political divides, and provides for a space to develop joint ideas on how to respond to or prevent environmental risks. We have applied this approach throughout our engagement at the governorate and the national levels. For instance, we employed community dialogues, and based on our insights from consultations, our colleague Su'ada Salahi, who's our lead for the project engagement inside Yemen, convened influential individuals in community dialogues to reflect on these findings with a specific view to their own governorate. The dialogues brought together key decision makers, local leaders, civil society, and local authority representatives from different groups, opening a unique space for exchange among actors who don't usually sit together. The participants identified joint priorities relating to the environment in their governorates, reflecting on ways to enhance the management of natural resources, such as water, improve environmental protection, or even adapt to climate change. The dialogues concluded with the drafting and signing of 3 outcome documents, a sort of an informal agreement that lays out the issues and provide a small framework to discuss with the governorate authorities. And of course, this can be scaled up to the regional and the national level. And we also had these technical meetings after our engagement with a large strata of Yemenis through the consultations and the community dialogues. We were set to share these voices and findings with the national authorities. We held so far 2 rounds of unilateral meetings with the technical and political representatives at the national level to present those findings, discuss the status of environmental governance in Yemen in general, and explore potential pathways for environmental dialogue and cooperation. We commenced this engagement last year with a series of these unilateral meetings that I mentioned with the different groups within the Yemeni government, which enabled discussions about the technical, political, and administrative dimensions of the environmental governance in Yemen. We were honestly, genuinely impressed by their openness to our environmental peacemaking approach and the profound discussions that we achieved in so little time, including reflections on strengthening governmental cooperation and fostering trust through collaborative environmental initiatives.
One question that came to mind as we were talking is the relationship between these assessments and some of this work that's happening in Yemen, and how, I guess, strengthening this evidence base through assessments, does that have any weight in terms of how you structure your work or build your work, or how can these assessments be beneficial?
The thing is that when we had, be it through the technical meetings or the community dialogues or even talking to the community officials, this is one of the things that we actually insisted on to establish that kind of baseline, because a lot of these officials did not know of the domino effect of these environmental issues and how they can cascade into feeding into the roots of the conflict and exacerbating the situation on the ground. So it kind of helped illuminate or shed light on these issues and use those to kind of augment, if you will, for the lack of a better word, the current peace process, so that they are addressed, but also that they contribute to the sustainability of any peace agreement in the future. As we mentioned earlier, these issues, yes, they're perceived sometimes at the very local level. They're not seen as immediate urgencies, but the moment you explain to the powers that be or the relevant authorities of how it actually can cascade and mushroom, if you will, into bigger problems that increases the number of issues that the government and the local authorities have to deal with, that's when you grab their attention. And that's when they become more interested. And this is what we witness from the various discussions that we have, especially from the unilateral meetings that we had over the past year.
That's really great to hear, especially it sounds like a lot of these findings from the surveys you conducted and environment really coming out as a top concern, a top priority to address, that something like a report or an assessment, something grounded in a little bit more factual evidence base, can really help make the case at this higher level and with authorities. So now is the time in our conversation when we're going to zoom out and look at the international stage. Coming to you, Sinéad. Despite the scale of the humanitarian and environmental crisis that we're speaking about, that's outlined in the report, kind of the crux of the work that EIP is doing, conversations within the international community seem quite focused on Yemen's place within the wider geopolitical escalations. Is anything that I'm saying sounding just wrong?
Yeah, unfortunately, this does seem to be the trend. And as Hisham can attest to much more strongly than I can, it has been a big struggle to secure Yemen a spot on international peace and security agendas, or even in the news coverage. And in fact, in the last 10 years of civil war in Yemen, though little has been reported internationally, that Yemen has often been dubbed the forgotten crisis. But this has changed somewhat in the last year, and listeners will probably have heard Yemen resurface in the news cycle. And this kind of coverage has often focused on regional security escalations, most notably Houthi attacks on international shipping routes in the Red Sea in response to the war on Gaza. Also, it's often the case that when Yemen does feature on international agendas, it's usually discussed at more hard security fora and from a geopolitical angle. And this has been true of many really key international fora. For example, just last weekend at the Munich Security Conference, there was a session on the Red Sea, and some human security issues like poverty and displacement were mentioned. But yeah, overall, the conversation was very, very much hard security focused, mostly revolving around counterterrorism, Iranian involvement in Yemen, and US and European economic interests in the Red Sea. So yeah, I guess just to get back to your question, it's important to be straightforward, and we really can't overestimate the impacts of the war on human and climate security in Yemen. So clearly this is crucial, and on the one hand, we can't really tell the story of climate change, environmental destruction, and associated human insecurity in Yemen without including this dimension. And also, as I said, Yemen has been rarely featured on international agendas for the last decade, despite rising humanitarian catastrophes. So there's some limited extent to which resurgent interest from the international community offers an opportunity to highlight climate, peace and security issues. But at the same time, this line should be tread very, very carefully. And as international attention is very much focused on geopolitical dimensions of the conflict, and particularly on its own economic and security interests, there is a risk of other issues like climate impacts, displacement, food insecurity, and local conflict being sidelined by these broader issues. And we need to be persistent in pushing these issues forward and ensuring that the priorities of Yemenis, which, as Hisham said, really do include climate and environmental action, can steer the agenda.
Thanks very much, Sinéad. Before we wrap up this episode, of course, we can't talk about geopolitical priorities, these dimensions, without also talking about the funding aspect that comes with these shifting priorities within the international community. So, Hisham, to wrap us up, I guess we're going to a relatively big question. And just for the record, since priorities can shift so rapidly, we're recording this episode on the 18th of February, so anything regards to current funding status is accurate up to this point. But in the last few weeks, U.S. funding cuts have dominated conversations in many of our circles, and we wanted to come to you to ask a little bit about international aid in Yemen and the future. And a lot of this is USAID funding, which the agency manages over 40 billion, at least in 2023, for 130 different countries, with Yemen within the top 10 of recipients. So in the immediate term, what kind of impacts will this last with the lack of USAID funding have at the district and community level? And how do you think finance will change going forward? Is there anything that we can already kind of expect or prepare for? And what can other international actors do to support Yemen and Yemeni people in navigating these challenges, especially with gaps that are now coming about within like funding infrastructure?
Well, Alex, I'm glad you asked that question because that's troubling a lot of people.
I'm glad that we have you to discuss, especially with your past experience. And are you currently joining us from DC right now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so you're in the thick of it all.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of confusion, honestly, over the past 2 weeks and how that will impact everybody across the board, not just Yemen. But as you can imagine, the humanitarian consequences or the funding cut are devastating. Already now, Yemen is one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises, with 2/3 of the population depending on humanitarian aid. And the recently announced USAID freeze was an additional blow within that context, as it will enforce the cessation of countless programs that deliver food, water, sanitation services, and medicine, not to mention the longer-term support for peacebuilding initiatives, economic recovery, and other efforts to build resilience after the 10 years of full-scale internationalized war. I mean, if we're being honest, USAID was the largest provider of humanitarian assistance to Yemen over the past years, especially through the World Food Program and other UN agencies. So the implications for food security will be significant and across the board with other programs as well. So here's a bit of a call of action. I mean, looking forward, as long as a shift in rhetoric is out of sight, the international community must step up their funding support for humanitarian, peacebuilding, and peacemaking efforts to allow for the recovery from the conflict. And on that venue, integrated programming such as environmental peacemaking and peacebuilding can provide an opportunity for joint humanitarian, economic, peace, and environmental impact that can contribute to resolving the crisis in Yemen. As the conflict grows increasingly complex and intractable, practitioners and donors need to find innovative entry points that will allow to overcome some of these new challenges in funding.
Okay, I think that is a very strong call to action to leave us on. Over the course of the conversation, now just open to the both of you. Any other points that you want to hit, questions that you think we should have gone over? Happy to ask any additional questions or fit in any further thoughts that either of you have.
Honestly, I think Sinéad put a very strong case on how Yemen has been dubbed the forgotten conflict. And my fear is that people might prioritize only political issues if they pay attention at all to Yemen, and they forget about the roots of the conflict and issues like addressing environmental issues and climate change. And this is why our work with our partners in Adelphi and other counterparts are actually quite crucial at the current stage.
Thanks. Sinead?
Thanks. I wanted to go beyond my answering scope to maybe ask Hisham a question. That's okay. But yeah, I was wondering if, like you said, about practitioners and people in Yemen are really going to have to look for really innovative ways to try to make things work despite these circumstances. And I was wondering if this has been happening already and what has this looked like in your experience? How are people overcoming these challenges despite the enormous adversity?
Well, in terms of funding, people are starting to think outside the box. Honestly, it took a lot of people by surprise, the funding cuts. So we're still in the middle of the fray, basically, within the past 2 weeks. So people are pivoting and kind of attaching their projects, for instance, when coming to the environment, kind of including it in a larger project that has to do with reconciliation. And I've seen a couple of proposals, for instance, over the past 10 days, where people pitch a security proposal, because that would resonate better, given what's happening in the Red Sea, given the more attention towards the conflict in Gaza, and kind of then attaching an addendum, if you will, of something that addresses the environment as an afterthought. But realizing where the donor's attention is, they're thinking that's going to be basically our carrot to garner interest. And then we could just add aspects to our projects that can address the issues that are of concern to us at the local level.
Yeah, really interesting. And like you said, it's a delicate balance, right? Because you don't want these things to be sidelined by the...
As you mentioned, Sinead, earlier, it is one of the priorities that came out from our consultations, and we were kind of taken aback by it and surprised by it, is that people are attuned to what environmental challenges mean and how that impact their lives. There's that level of awareness, which is very much appreciated. And now people are more, the officials are more aware of how there's a need to address those issues. So we don't want to lose that momentum now, that the focus is shifting from Yemen, that the funding is going down, and people are start thinking in terms of military only and security only and political discussions alone without addressing these climate change issues and environmental issues.
And I imagine towards the end of last year, or especially throughout, how conflict and like fragile states have had a greater spotlight at things like COP. I think a lot of the different op-eds I've read have talked about, a need for maybe not activating some of these defense money pots, but trying to create better climate finance to also fund some of these projects. But given the current political situation, it's not only humanitarian aid, but so much climate funding has also been cut that throws in another kind of curveball to some of this momentum. So maybe all in all, some of these greater security focused and more traditional, harder security is then the only option in some cases to ensure that it isn't like a complete cutoff of funding. Thanks so much to the both of you for joining us for this month's episode, Hisham and Sinead. It's been a really insightful conversation about the circumstances that Yemen faces and the multifaceted challenges amongst ongoing conflict and environmental stressors. Yemen remains embroiled in severe civil war with the internationally recognized government, the Houthis, and various national and regional actors all vying for control. This prolonged conflict has devastated the nation's infrastructure, economy, and social fabric, leaving a significant portion of the population reliant on humanitarian aid. The economic situation is also dire, with Yemeni currency plummeting to historic lows, further exacerbating the hardship for everyday citizens. And of course, this crisis is compounded by environmental degradation, driven by military activities, unsustainable resource extraction, and climate change has intensified these issues with increasing incidents of droughts and floods, further straining already scarce resources. Water scarcity is a pressing issue, exacerbated by the weaponization of water resources in conflict. And of course, this also leads to heightened tensions amongst communities. Arable land is diminishing due to desertification and flooding, which can create additional conflict over land use and ownership. And of course, I know we already haven't painted quite a hopeful picture, but funding challenges was also a key component of our conversation, with significant cuts from major donors like USAID threatening to halt critical programs that provide food, water, and medical services. These funding shortfalls also have the potential to jeopardize long-term peace building and economic recovery and efforts. And this creates a big gap and a need for the international community to step in and support Yemen through different initiatives and funding. This episode underscored the importance of integrating environmental considerations into peacebuilding efforts, with projects like Environmental Pathways for Reconciliation emphasizing using environmental challenges as opportunities for dialogue and cooperation, aiming to foster resilience and sustainable peace in Yemen. Hopefully that is a slight hopeful outlook on the potential for peace building and integrating the environment as an opportunity for further resilience. So thank you once again to you both. This has been the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in and for joining us. We'll be back with a new episode next month. And in the meantime, you can find us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. Until next time, goodbye.